G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Book of Daniel. This study has been produced by Dr. Alan Fruchtenbaum of RL Ministries Worldwide. Thank you for coming along. So we're now into session 10 of the Book of Daniel. We're going to cover from chapter 6, verse 10 down to chapter 7, verse 5. When we finished off the last session, we had some conspiracies against Daniel by the satraps and the presidents. They were trying to remove Daniel from his office. He was the one in charge of them. There were two conspiracies against him. First of all, they were trying to find some fault in him misusing his authority and high position to his own benefit, but they couldn't find anything in that area. He was faithful in every area. The second conspiracy was aimed at his worship of the one true God. Daniel's worship of the one true God had been observed for a very long time now, beginning in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, back in chapter 1. So more than 70 years have now passed, and Daniel is still faithful to his God. So they conspire now to set up an occasion or a situation or an environment where his loyalty to God will now bring him into conflict with his loyalty to Darius the Mede. And then they think they'll have solid ground for an accusation against Daniel. And so they concoct this plan and bring it to Darius that anyone who made a petition of any god or man that is a priest, except for Darius, for a period of 30 days, he's to suffer the death penalty into the lion's den with him. So Darius enters into this agreement. He makes it law, which could not be repealed. So the trap for Daniel is now set. And now as we move into verse 10, we see here the accusation that's going to be brought against Daniel in verses 10 to 15. And when Daniel, this is verse 10, and when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house. Now his windows were open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, and he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed, and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. Then these men assembled together and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's interdict. Have you not signed an interdict that every man that shall make a petition unto any god or man within 30 days, save unto you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not. Then answered they and said before the king, that Daniel, who is of the children of the captivity of Judah, regards not you, O king, nor the interdict that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to rescue him. Then these men assembled together unto the king, and said unto the king, Know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no interdict nor statutes which the king establishes may be changed. So now, the accusation against Daniel in these verses comes up because in verses 10 to 11, we see that Daniel continues in his faithfulness. He doesn't stop praying. We're told about his prayer life. He knows about this new decree that he's not allowed to pray to his God except through Darius the Mede. But in spite of that, he ignored the decree and continued his normal practice, which was to go up into an upper chamber in his house, which had a window open toward Jerusalem. Daniel continued to pray 3 times a day with his windows open, facing the direction in which the city of Jerusalem lay. Now, why did he face Jerusalem? Because when King Solomon built the temple, he said that if a Jew is outside the land, he should always pray facing the temple which is in Jerusalem. So Daniel, here, according to what King Solomon decreed, Daniel is now praying toward the city of Jerusalem in keeping with 1 Kings 8, 44 to 50, and 2 Chronicles 6, 36 to 39. Yeah, in both these passages, the principle was laid down that if Jews were living outside the land, they must face toward Jerusalem when they prayed. So here we have Daniel following this practice. As he prayed, he kneeled upon his knees. He prayed at 3 different times during each day. You know, Jews seldom pray on their knees today, but that was the Jewish format in biblical times. And the content of his prayer was that he gave thanks before his God. He continued to make his petitions before his God as he usually did, without reference to Darius and his decree. And to this day, Orthodox Jews follow the same prayer practice. They pray 3 times a day, facing toward Jerusalem. In fact, every synagogue you will ever enter will always be facing the city of Jerusalem. So, depending where in the world it is situated, whether north, south, east, or west, every one of them is built facing in the direction of the city of Jerusalem. Now, Daniel could have tried to come up with all kinds of excuses here so he could avoid being observed. Did God really care whether his window was open or not? Probably not. He could have closed his window while praying 3 times a day, so no one could have seen him. And being in this difficult situation, he could have justified all kinds of compromises. After all, he could pray just as well walking around. He didn't have to get down on his knees as per usual. But Daniel, type of man Daniel was not going to let this interdict or this edict from the king or his enemies force him to change his normal religious practices. This is the way he's done it before. He'll continue to do it this way. He refuses to be intimidated either by the conspirators or by this decree that could actually cost him his life. And because of his strength in not compromising, the entrapment comes in verse 11. Just as they were hoping to do, these men trapped Daniel in their conspiracy. These men assembled together for the second time, only to observe what Daniel was doing. They find him making petitions and supplications before his God. Now they have him in violation of this new law. And then in verses 12 to 13, they report back to Darius the Mede. In verse 12, they reaffirm that a decree had been signed, and that the punishment for non-compliance was clearly stated. The fact that there was such a decree is validated by Darius in verse 12. So in verses 13, they lay their accusations against Daniel. They refer, first of all, to what Daniel, who is of the children of the captivity of Judah, they refer to him that. Notice the way this phrase is said. It's the emphasis here is on Daniel's Jewishness. This Daniel, he's one of the children of the captivity of Judah. He's one of those Jews. This Jew you appointed over us is flouting your decree. This is what they're actually saying. This is an anti-Semitic element here. And they accuse Daniel of not respecting Darius, which Daniel would never do. They say he does not regard or honor Darius. They say he regards not you nor the interdict that you have signed. And he shows this by continuing to make petitions to his own God 3 times a day. And at this point, Darius realizes that he has been set up and trapped. Now, any commandment, law, or decree signed by the king could never be repealed according to the law of the Medes and Persians. Even if it was recognized that a decree was a mistake, nothing could be done to repeal it. Now, verse 15 reveals that at sundown, the king received further pressure from the conspirators. Then these men assembled together unto the king and said unto the king, Know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians, that no interdict nor statute which the king establishes may be changed. So for a third time, these conspirators, they barge into the palace in order to put pressure on the king. The term, what we see here, know, O king, is an imperative. This is what they're saying to the king. Darius was forced to remember that under Persian law, no decree could be repealed. He was also forced to now remember the punishment that had been decreed. And we see in verses 16 to 17, we see the sentence now being passed upon poor Daniel. Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel. and cast him into the den of lions. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, Your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. And a stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. So in verse 16, we see the penalty of the decree is carried out, and Daniel is cast into the den of lions. And as he's being carried out to the place of execution, before he's cast into it, Darius holds out some hope for him, or holds out some hope to him. He says, Daniel, he says, your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. Now, that's the sort of comforting that someone will say to a dying man. You know, Darius, he's not making an affirmation of faith here. He's not believing that it will really happen. He's only expressing willful thinking, wishful thinking here. We see it in the following verses, that Darius did not really believe that Daniel could still be alive, although he hopes it will be the case. In verse 17, the king and his lords, they sealed the stone placed over the mouth of the lion's den. And once the stone was moved into position, sealing the entrance to the den, the king put his seal upon it. And then the conspirators also put their seals upon it as well. They could not then break the king's seal without bringing execution upon themselves. You know, Darius could not even break his own seal without violating the laws of the Medes and the Persians. So they were all tied into the conspiracy now, so that nothing could be changed according or concerning Daniel. Daniel would have to remain there until the morning. But while man thinks nothing can be changed, God can completely reverse what man has set up. So we come to the deliverance of Daniel next. We see this in verses 18 to 23. We see the concern of Darius in verses 18 to 20. Then the king went to his palace, and he passed the night fasting. Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste unto the den of lions. And when he came near unto the den to Daniel, he cried with a lamentable voice. The king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is your God whom you serve continually able to deliver you from the lions? In verses 18 to 20, we're now told that Darius was depressed the whole night over what had just been done, and he could not get around it because of the nature of the Persian law. And then verse 18 tells us he spent the night fasting instead of feasting. Neither were instruments of music brought before him. The word translated instruments here does not necessarily mean musical instruments at all, but it could actually be dancing girls. That is one interpretation of this. So it could be entertainment. Essentially, what this verse is saying is that on that night there was no wine, no women or song for Darius. Neither was there any sleep, because it says his sleep fled from him. He was waiting for morning to come when he could legally open the lion's den. Early in the morning, in verse 19, he arose. And as soon as he was legally permitted to go to the place of execution, he now goes out to the lion's den. And in verse 20, he cried with a lamentable voice. This is the kind of cry with which one begins to lament over the death of a family member or a close friend. He's wailing pretty much. And this shows that Darius expects Daniel to have been killed, even though he had made that wishful statement back in verse 16. But even so, there was still one little ounce of hope left in him. So when he arrived, he still asked the questions. O Daniel, servant of the living God, was the God you serve really able to deliver you? And then suddenly, against his own expectation, a voice comes out of the den. Then Daniel said unto the king, O king, live forever. My God hath sent his angel and has shut the lions' mouths, and they have not hurt me. For as much as before him innocency was found in me, and also before you, O king, have I done no hurt. So in verse 21, Daniel now addresses Darius with his royal title, O King, live forever. So what we see here is that there was no bitterness or animosity in Daniel's heart against what Darius had done. And then in verse 22, he explained what had happened. The means of his escaping death was that God sent his angel who had kept the mouths of the lions shut. And just as the angel was used previously to deliver the three friends of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the fiery furnace, God also used an angel to shut the mouths of the lions. And the reason was, first of all, because Daniel was completely innocent before God. And second, he was not guilty of any crime against the king. And now we see the response of Darius in verse 23. Then was the king exceeding glad and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he had trusted in his God. So Darius, exceedingly glad, he orders Daniel to be brought up out of the den. Then he ordered a full-scale inspection of his person, just as Nebuchadnezzar had done with his three friends when they came up out of the furnace earlier on in the book. Not only were there no big bite marks in his legs, there's not so much as a scratch or a claw mark upon him. It says, no manner of hurt was found upon him, nothing at all. No lion had touched him, and Daniel points out that this happened because he trusted in his God. So, now it's the conspirators' turn. We read in verse 24 that the conspirators themselves suffer the same fate they'd planned for Daniel. Verse 24, and the king commanded, and they brought those men that had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives. And the lions had mastery of them, and brake all their bones in pieces, before they came to the bottom of the den. Now, because their web of lies had been unraveled, Daniel's accusers are now cast into the den of lions. And notice that their wives and children also suffered the same fate. Now, of course, this would have been contrary to Mosaic law in what we see in Deuteronomy 24:16 and 2 Kings 14:5-6. Deuteronomy 24:16 states that the fathers shall not be put to death for the children, neither shall the children be put to death for the fathers. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin. So, this could never happen under Mosaic law. However, it was not the law of Moses which governed the kingdom of the Medes and Persians, but it was Persian law. And under Persian law, when a man committed a crime worthy of death, his entire family was executed. So not only these conspirators, but everyone belonging to their family was executed under the immutable nature of a Persian law. And to prove that the reason why Daniel escaped injury is not because the lions were not hungry, it mentions that even before they had fallen to the bottom of the den, they grabbed the unfortunate victims and had mastery of them and break all their bones in pieces. Now, it's the conspirators who were consumed by the lions, and it shows that these lions were definitely hungry, but the angel had kept them from feasting on Daniel during the night. Now, somebody has said that the reason Daniel was not touched is because these lions were not hungry. Well, this is disproved by what happened to the conspirators and their families. There was no angelic protection for them. So now we see Darius, he issues another decree in verses 25-27. Then King Darius wrote unto all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and steadfastly forever, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So now in verse 25, Darius issues this new decree, and he issues it with a salutation to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. Now, The word earth here would be better translated by the word land. It's not referring to the entire earth, but it's referring to the province of Babylon, because Darius did not have any authority over anyone outside of that province. Because remember, he himself was under the authority of Cyrus the Great, the Persian. Now, what we see here is now the decree was limited to the province of Babylon. And in keeping with the typical salutation, he says, peace be multiplied unto you. Aramaic term here for peace, shalom, means welfare or prosperity. So Darius's greeting includes more than just peace. It includes the total welfare of those addressed. And Darius greeted his subjects by expressing the hope that everything would go well with them. And in verses 26 and 27, he gives us the content of the decree. In verse 26, I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, and again, limited to the province of Babylon here. And the decree is that Daniel's God would be an object of reverence. He spells out 5 things about Daniel's God. First of all, men should tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, because it's what we see. Second, for he is a living God. Third, he is steadfast forever. Fourth, God has a kingdom that shall not be destroyed. And fifth, this God's dominion shall be even to the end of the earth. So, nothing that Darius says in the words of verse 27, where he spells out some of God's works in heaven and earth, and his deliverance of Daniel by themselves, violate the polytheism of the Persian Empire and their religion of Zoroastrianism. Therefore, as with Nebuchadnezzar, so with Darius the Mede, we cannot say that either of them had saving faith. They were syncretists, and so they adopted Jehovah and gave him a great amount of honor and glory amongst their other gods. But the important thing about saving faith included making Jehovah the one and only God, so that no other God would ever exist beside him. Now, this is not what Nebuchadnezzar nor Darius did. So while these men came very close to saving faith, neither came far enough to have saving faith. Neither of them had saving faith in the Old Testament sense of the term. By themselves, Darius's statements are insufficient to assume that he became a saved man, because all this could be said about Daniel's God without denouncing any other God, which is exactly what he did. And in this verse, he mentions his signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, and how he had rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. Now, Zoroastrianism, it's a Persian religion founded in the 6th century BC by the prophet Zoroaster, and it promulgated in the Avesta and characterized by worship of a supreme god called Ahura Mazda, who requires good deeds for help in his cosmic struggle against the evil spirit Ahriman. That's what Zoroastrianism is. Now, we see the conclusion of chapter 6 in verse 28. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So Daniel prospered in the reign of both Cyrus the Persian and Darius the Mede. Cyrus, remember, was the emperor of the entire Median Persian Empire, while Darius the Mede was the man who was appointed as a secondary ruler over the province and the capital of Babylon. He had authority over the satraps and the 2 presidents under him. He reported only to Darius and by extension to the emperor Cyrus the Persian. Now we know from Daniel chapter 10:1 that Daniel served at least until 536 BC, and he continued to live through the 3rd year of Cyrus the Persian. So he lived another 2 or 3 years at least after the events of chapter 6. So Darius ruled over the province of Babylon, while Cyrus ruled over the entire Medo-Persian Empire. Daniel now served in his role as governor of the province of Babylon at least until he was about 85 years old, 84, 85 years old. So he's getting on. Now, in closing this section of chapter 6, 3 lessons to be learned from in the context of Daniel's theme of the times of the Gentiles. Remember, that's Daniel's theme, the times of the Gentiles. It's a time from the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians in 586 BC, where from then on, right down until the coming of Messiah, Jerusalem will be dominated by Gentiles. So the first lesson we learn is that Jews will always prosper in the dispersion to a lesser or greater degree, and their prosperity may not necessarily be economic. Usually in Jewish history, their prosperity has not been economic. However, they do prosper in other areas, in the sciences, the arts, and elsewhere. Second, what we learn here is that this chapter teaches that for this very reason, the diaspora Jews will always be in danger because of the jealousy felt by the Gentiles, which will lead to the rise of anti-Semitism. Wherever Jews have attained prominence in any area, whether it be in the realm of science, finance, music, medicine, or any sphere of endeavor whatsoever, it has always created a degree of jealousy among Gentiles, which then leads to anti-Semitism. And as a result, there'll always be attacks against the Jews. Third lesson is that in spite of the threats against the Jews as a people, they'll always survive, as Daniel did, as his 3 friends did. So this does not mean that Jews will not be killed. Many individuals have indeed suffered and died, but the Jews as a people group will always survive. Okay, we're now moving into section 7, if you like. We're looking at the 4 beasts, and this is going to go from chapter 7 verse 1 down to chapter 7 verse 28. With chapter 7 now, we more or less leave the history section of Daniel and move into the prophetic sections of his book, though there'll be a little bit of history interspersed with them. The historical section did have some prophecy. Now the prophetic section will have some history. As we're going to see, this chapter has a very strong parallel with the 2nd chapter of Daniel, where we had a basic outline of the 4 empires that spanned the times of the Gentiles. Now in chapter 7, we're going to get a repeat of all of that, but we're going to have a lot more detail, greater detail. And to get a total picture of what the times of the Gentiles consist of, 4 chapters of scripture need to be studied. They are Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, and Revelation chapter 13 and Revelation chapter 17, because each of these chapters builds upon each other. We're only going to be dealing with the book of Daniel. We're only going to go as far as Daniel's prophecies take us. We're not going to be looking into the book of Revelation as such. Okay. So now we see the dream. We see they're dream visions actually in verses 1 to 14 of chapter 7. See the introduction in verse 1. In the 1st year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told us some of the matters. So in verse 1, the first thing that we're now given here is the date when this dream occurred. We're told that it was in the 1st year of Belshazzar, which would be the year 553 BC. It was at that point when he was made co-regent with his father Nabonidus, who had taken the throne 3 years earlier in 556 BC. So we're in the year 553 BC, and it is 14 years before the fall of Babylon and the events of chapter 5. So Nebuchadnezzar has now been dead for 9 years. And during that period, there has been a rapid series of governments with 3 kings ruling in quick succession. 2 of them had been assassinated before Nabonidus usurped the throne, and 3 years later made Belshazzar his co-regent. Now, as we noted from statements back in chapter 5, during the course of this political instability, Daniel had been demoted somewhere along the line, and so was no longer holding the extremely high position which he had under King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel himself would now be about 67 or 60 years of age at this point. Remember that the book of Daniel was not written in chronological sequence. He was not concerned with writing history, but with developing a specific theme. So chapter 7 actually occurs historically between chapters 4 and 5. I know it's a bit confusing, but when we read a book, we think it goes chronologically, but not so with all the Bible books. The only one we really know is Luke. He says he writes it in chronological order. Now, in this chapter, we have the first of Daniel's personal dream visions. Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. The Aramaic term for he had a dream, chazah, means to see or to behold by vision. I didn't write it there. Okay. So the only vision to have been dealt with so far was the one we saw back in chapter 2. However, that was not a vision that was given to Daniel. That vision was given to Nebuchadnezzar, but the interpretation was given to Daniel. But here in chapter 7 now, we have the first of the visions given to Daniel. Even so, we're going to find that further elaboration of the material that was given in Nebuchadnezzar's vision of chapter 2. That's what we're going to find here in chapter 7. So this also deals with the 4 Gentile empires. But while there's a great deal of similarity between the 2 visions, there's also certain differences which need to be pointed out, which we're going to point out. In verse 1, we're told that after he had seen this dream vision, Daniel wrote it down. And he says, and told the sum of the matters. So as soon as he had received the whole vision, he wrote it down so that he did not forget it. It says he also told the sum, which means he told the main features of it, but did not tell us everything that he saw. He included the most important features, which are the ones God wished him to include in his book for our learning and understanding. So that is what we have in chapter 7. Note that the word visions in verse 1 is in the plural. Altogether, Daniel sees 4 distinct visions. Now, these differences occur in 3 areas between chapter 2 and chapter 7, the Nebuchadnezzar's dream and Daniel's visions here. The first concerns the visionary himself. In chapter 2, the one who received the vision was the pagan king Nebuchadnezzar. But in chapter 7, it is to Daniel, a prophet of the one true God. The second difference is in who serves as the interpreter. In chapter 2, it was Daniel. But in chapter 7, it is an angel who interprets it to Daniel. A third area of difference concerns the perspective of the 4 Gentile empires mentioned in each chapter. In Daniel 2, we find a man's view of the times of the Gentiles as something being majestic. Nebuchadnezzar's image was indeed majestic as he saw it towering over him. It was huge. But then in chapter 7, we have God's perspective of the same 4 Gentile empires. But from his perspective, he sees them in their beastly character. It is animalistic. Their awesome character is missing here. For what we see is a beastly character. The first vision is in verses 2 to 6, and first up we look at the great sea in verses 2 to 3. Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven break forth upon the great sea. And 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. So in these 2 verses, verses 2 and 3, as the first vision opens up, Daniel looks upon the great sea, which in verse 2 is suffering a degree of agitation. Also in verse 2, he says, I saw, which means I was beholding, or I was looking at, or watching. He's going to use this term 8 different times in this chapter. And the tense of this verb implies that this was a continuous act or experience. He was continuously gazing and studiously examining what it was he was looking at. Although it was not unusual for the sea to be agitated, there was something unusual about the agitation of this sea. As for the vision, as the vision now develops, he sees the four winds of heaven stirring up the great sea. So these four winds are the same in number as the four Gentile empires spelled out back in chapter 2. But now in Scripture, the winds of heaven often refer to God's sovereignty and providence. Now, Dr. Fruchtenbaum, he thinks that this is the emphasis here. It is God's providence in history. Daniel has already said several times that it is God who controls who will sit upon the thrones of the earth and who will not. He is in total control. He raises up kingdoms, brings down kingdoms. So God is in sovereign control of anyone who ever gains a position of authority, and these four winds represent his sovereign control. This means that none of the four Gentile empires arise in history by accident or as a matter of course, but are part of the divine plan of God who is in control. Same thing today. No leader rises up on his own. It is God who raises up leaders. It is God who raises up powers today. These four winds break forth upon the great sea. To break forth means to cause it to be greatly disturbed. In Scripture, the Great Sea usually refers to the Mediterranean Sea. We find it described in this way in a number of Old Testament passages. Numbers 34, 6-7, Joshua 1 verse 4, Joshua 9, 1, Joshua 15, 11-12, Joshua 15, 47, Joshua 23, 4, Ezekiel 47, 10 and 15, and 19 and 20, and 48, 28. So we see this multiple times that this great sea is the Mediterranean Sea. Now, all of these references are dealing here with the western boundary of the Promised Land. So that clearly, the Great Sea in those passages is referring to the Mediterranean Sea. So these four Gentile empires will arise somewhere in the vicinity of the Mediterranean Sea. By the same token, we also know from parallel scriptures that when the word sea is used symbolically, it is always a consistent symbol for the Gentile nations. And we find this in Isaiah chapter 17, verses 12-13. We also find it in Matthew 13, 47-50. They're written down there on the slide. Revelation 13:1 and Revelation 17:1 and 15 also mentions this. Revelation passages are significant because those two chapters give us further elaboration on the theme of the times of the Gentiles. So not only now does this fix the general area around the Mediterranean Sea as a geographical region from which these four Gentile empires will arise, it tells us that they'll arise specifically out of the Gentile world. It also says that as these four beasts arise, each one is diverse one from another. Now, historians have noted the differences between these four empires. The first empire, which is Babylonian, was characterized by being regal or royal. And then on the other hand, the second empire, the empire of the Medo-Persians, was characterized as being voluptuous. Third empire was characterized by Greek culture, while the fourth was characterized by Roman imperialism. Each one was different from the others in that way. Now, the first beast we see in verse 4. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand upon 2 feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. So in this first vision, Daniel sees the first 3 of the 4 beasts. In verse 4, the first one he sees is the same empire which is represented by Nebuchadnezzar's head of gold in chapter 2. This represents the Babylonian Empire. He sees this first beast as lion-like. Now, in each case, the animal he sees is not exactly what we see in the animal kingdom. It is only similar. So the first beast, he says, looks like a lion and has certain features of a lion. but it also has certain features which a real lion does not actually have. This one has the wings of an eagle. However, as the lion is the king of beasts, so the eagle is the king of birds. So both of these are fitting symbols for what Babylon actually was. In fact, elsewhere in scriptures, especially in Jeremiah, both these symbols are used for Babylon. The lion symbol is used in Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 7, and 49:19, and 50, verse 17 and 44. Jeremiah also used the eagle as a symbol for Babylon in 48, verse 40, and 49, verse 22. And in this respect, Jeremiah is now followed by Ezekiel in chapter 17, verse 3. In fact, the most famous gate into the city of Babylon was the Ishtar Gate, which had reliefs of winged lions on it. So this is a fitting symbol for the Babylonian Empire. But in verse 4, Daniel is looking at this first beast during the course of time. During the course of time, the eagle's wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand upon 2 feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. Now, so what we see here is that when Daniel was gazing at the lion-like and eagle-like winged creature, he noticed 4 events that affected the beast. First, its wings were plucked. Second, it was lifted up from the earth. Third, it was made to stand upon 2 feet as a man. And fourth, it was given a man's heart. So the description here harks back to Nebuchadnezzar's experiences in chapter 4. It represents both Nebuchadnezzar himself and his empire. Because as nearly as a man could become a beast, remember, Nebuchadnezzar's madness created just such an illusion in his mind in chapter 4. As nearly as a beast could become a man, so did Babylon eventually lost its beast-like nature and took on a more humane character. Then eventually Babylon lost its animalistic characteristic and became more human. So this reflects the change from a lust for conquest to a preference for building and developing a highly cultured society. That was what happened to Babylon. Now we see the second beast in verse 5. And behold, another beast, a second like to a bear, and it was raised up on one side, and there were three ribs were in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. So in verse 5, we now have the second beast, and this represents the second Gentile empire. And it corresponds to the chest and arms of silver in Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2. This is the Medo-Persian Empire. So what Daniel sees here is a creature which is bear-like. It's not a real bear, but it has certain similarities and dissimilarities which remind him of a bear. It looks a bit like a bear, but it's not actually a bear. The bear, of course, it's a lot less majestic than the lion. Yet in Scripture, it is often connected with the lion. 4 examples would include 1 Samuel 17, verse 34 to 36, Proverbs 28:15, Hosea 13:8, Proverbs 28:15, Hosea 13:8, and Amos 5:19. Amos 5:19. So the bear is much heavier than the lion. It is bulky and weighty and usually overcomes its prey by sheer force and weight. So this particular bear that Daniel sees, it seems to walk lopsided. It was raised up on one side. Now, this reflects the historic reality of how the Medo-Persian Empire conquered. In one respect, it was by sheer weight of numbers. But just as a bear moves more slowly than a lion, so did the Medo-Persian Empire move more slowly in its military campaigns. The loss of speed was caused by its enormous size. The Medo-Persian forces conquered by sheer force of numbers. The size of Xerxes' army has been the subject of a lot of debate, with estimates ranging from 60,000 to 2.5 million soldiers. That's what the ancients estimate. The moderns say, no, it couldn't be that big. Whatever it is, it was big. And just as Daniel now noticed that this bear was lopsided, so this empire, which was a union between the Medes and the Persians outnumbering the Medes, and therefore they were the more dominant power. So although this empire was united under one head, it was still a lopsided union, with the Medes being the lesser of the two. This bear also had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. Now, as we look at history and look at the point where Medo-Persia took on its empire status, we find that it conquered 3 other kingdoms: Lydia, which it conquered in 546 BC, Babylon in 539 BC, and Egypt, which was in 525 BC. These 3 kingdoms are represented by the 3 ribs which were found in the bear's mouth. It was by crushing these 3 kingdoms that this beast attained its empire status. And then at the end of verse 5, they said thus unto it, "Arise, devour much flesh." So this means that after the conquest of these 3 kingdoms, it was given further power for conquest beyond these 3 ribs, and certainly that is exactly what it did do, what did occur. And that is where we're going to leave it for this session. So study hard, grow strong,